In the bitter cold of February 2007, the Whitford family set out from their cozy home in Wasilla, Alaska, planning nothing more ambitious than a simple weekend visit to relatives. They never made it. The roads, though lined with ice, were clear enough for travel. Their SUV had been meticulously maintained, and the weather service reported no approaching storms. Yet somewhere between their driveway and their destination, they vanished. Search teams combed the route mile by mile, snowshoeing through ditches, probing frozen banks, scanning every bend and culvert. Nothing. Not a single tire mark in the snow. No twisted metal in a ravine. No hint of the family's presence. For a decade, the case lingered like a half-remembered nightmare in the community. A story traded in low voices over diner coffee, whispered by the fire on long winter nights. The ending was always the same: a shrug, a muttered guess. They probably slid off into some deep spot we'll never find. That uneasy assumption held until January 2017, when a lone hunter skirted the rim of Copperhead Lake and spotted a shadow beneath the ice. At first glance, it looked like a submerged log, but as the early sun shifted, the shape sharpened, a roofline, glass reflecting in fractured sunlight, and the glint of a green license plate buried under more than a foot of ice. By nightfall, divers confirmed the unthinkable. The Whitford family's SUV was there, frozen in time, the cold preserving every detail. But the scene inside didn't match any theory investigators had clung to over the last 10 years. Across the valley, Jake Whitford was splitting firewood when the news found him. It was the same routine he'd kept for a decade, splitting until his shoulders throbbed, stacking until his back screamed, physical labor serving as both shield and punishment. Anything to keep from dwelling on that February morning and the call that had changed his life. The radio on his kitchen windowsill crackled as a broadcaster's voice drifted out into the frigid air. Breaking news from Copperhead Lake. A hunter has discovered what appears to be a vehicle beneath the ice, believed to be connected to the 2007 disappearance of the Whitford family. The maul slipped from Jake's hands, striking the frozen ground with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to echo in his chest. Whitford. His name, his family's name. David, Sarah, Katie, Tommy. 10 years of avoiding those names, 10 years of switching off the radio whenever a missing persons segment came on. 10 years of trying and failing to believe they'd driven south to start fresh, leaving behind the brother who had sent them down the wrong road. The next words from the radio made his knees weaken. The license plate matches that of the missing family's SUV. Jake caught himself on the chopping block, the rough bark scraping his palm until splinters bit into his skin. And then came the memory. David's voice on the phone that February morning, laced with fatigue and stress over the long drive to Anchorage. Road conditions look fine for the trip. You still think that lake route's faster? Jake, half awake and nursing a hangover from yet another night of drowning loneliness, had muttered something about the Copperhead Lake Road. Prettier, quicker, saving them 20 minutes. He'd never driven it himself. The radio voice intruded again. Vehicle appears to be intact beneath over a foot of ice. Intact. The word landed like a stone in his gut. Stumbling toward the house, Jake trudged through snow that crunched underfoot, each step pulling him back to that same hopeless February morning when the search parties had called it quits. He turned up the radio's volume until the tiny speaker buzzed with static. Dennis Ali, a local hunter, spotted what he initially thought was debris beneath the ice while checking his trap lines. State Police Detective Sarah Jensen has confirmed that the registration matches the 2007 missing persons case. Detective Jensen. He remembered her well. Young, relentless. The only one who seemed to hear him when he explained David's intended route. She'd questioned him twice about the lake road, puzzled by why his brother would take such a winding detour to Anchorage. Jake had lied then, claiming David liked scenic drives, that maybe the family wanted to see the frozen landscape. He'd never told her the truth, that he had recommended a road he'd never traveled, based on advice he couldn't even recall the source of. The kitchen suddenly felt like it was shrinking around him. Jake snatched his coat and stepped out into the crisp February air. His breath curled in ghostly plumes as he gazed across the valley toward the jagged silhouette of the mountains. Somewhere beyond that tree line, Copperhead Lake lay silent and still. Somewhere beneath its frozen skin, his brother's family waited. With numb fingers, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old contacts until he found her name. He'd never been able to delete it. She answered on the second ring. "Jensen, it's Jake Whitford." His voice cracked on his name. A pause, then softer. "Jake, I figured you'd call. Is it them? We won't know for certain until the vehicle's recovered, but the plates match and the location." She hesitated. "Jake, the car is exactly where you said David planned to drive." The words were a hammer blow exactly where he'd told them to go. "I need to see it," he said. "Jake, I don't think—" "I need to see what I did to them." Another pause. Longer this time. "The recovery starts tomorrow morning. I can't have you interfering with the investigation, but if you can keep your distance, you can watch." "I can handle it," he said, though the weight of the last decade told him otherwise. 10 years of waking with guilt crushing his chest. 10 years of wondering how long they'd lived in. The cold darkness before the ice claimed them. When the call ended, Jake wandered back to the woodpile. The mall lay where it had fallen, surrounded by half-split logs. For 10 years he'd been trying to cleave his memories apart the same way, splitting them into neat stacks, hoping to burn them away to ash and heat. But memories, he knew now, didn't burn. He saw David again in his mind's eye, grinning as he talked about the trip. Their first real vacation in years. His kids there already talking about sledding and hot cocoa. And Jake, without thinking, pointed them toward the lake road. Sarah's sister had just welcomed a new baby, and David was eager for Sarah to have that first chance to hold her niece. Katie, 17 and restless, had grumbled all morning about missing a school dance, declaring it would be the best one of the year. Tommy, only 8, couldn't stop peppering his parents with questions. Would they see moose? Maybe bears? Would the snow on the roadside be taller than him? It was an ordinary family, moving through the small, ordinary dramas of a weekend trip to see loved ones. A family with no idea their uncle's casual directions would take them to a silent grave under winter ice. Jake bent down and picked up the splitting maul again. The panic that had shaken him earlier was gone now, replaced by something heavier but steadier. Purpose. He had made up his mind. Tomorrow he would drive to Copperhead Lake. He would stand on the shore as they pulled his brother's family from their icy tomb. Tomorrow, the truth would no longer be a shapeless weight in his chest. Tomorrow, he would see, with his own eyes, the cost of his careless words. From the kitchen, the low hum of the radio continued, moving on from the breaking news to mundane weather forecasts and road reports. Normal updates for people living normal lives, untouched by a decade of carrying ghosts. Jake stayed outside, swinging the maul until the last sliver of daylight drained from the February sky. Each strike against the frozen wood felt like a prayer offered to no one, for a forgiveness he knew would never come. Above him, the night opened clear and cold. The first stars shimmered into view, exactly the same stars that had watched 10 years earlier as David's SUV disappeared into the wilderness Jake had sent them toward. Those same indifferent stars had looked down as the ice claimed them. Sleep never came. Jake sat hunched at the kitchen table, the room lit only by the lamp over the sink. In front of him lay his wallet, open to a photograph he'd carried for years. David, Sarah, Katie, and Tommy were at the 4th of July barbecue the summer before they vanished. David's arm was looped around Sarah's waist, the two of them laughing at some half-joke Jake had tossed out. The kids, mid-laugh, made ridiculous faces for the camera. Jake had been the one behind the lens that day, part of the laughter, part of the family before the winter. Holidays, before the argument that still gnawed at him, before that morning phone call that set everything in motion. He traced Tommy's face with the pad of his thumb. The boy's gap-toothed grin held a sparkler up to the camera, its flash captured like a star caught in his hand. By 6 a.m., Jake was behind the wheel, the heater blasting, heading toward Copperhead Lake. The sun rose slow and pale, brushing the snow with soft gold, the landscape so still and perfect that it might have been beautiful. If his gut weren't knotted so tight, he could barely draw a full breath. Halfway there, he passed the turnoff where David should have stayed on the main highway. The green highway sign slid past his passenger window like a quiet accusation. If David had ignored his advice and stayed on that road, his family would be alive. Instead, he'd followed his younger brother's suggestion and taken the so-called scenic route. Copperhead Lake lay in a low valley ringed with dark spruce that bristled against a flat gray sky. Jake spotted the recovery site from a quarter-mile away. Trucks and trailers parked along the shore. Men in bright orange suits scattered across the ice, moving with the careful precision of ants on a fragile glass plate. He parked behind a state police cruiser and walked toward the tree line, the cold slicing through his coat like it was nothing. His body felt distant, almost borrowed, as though he were watching someone else make this walk. Detective Sarah Jensen was waiting at the edge of the clearing. She was older now. 10 years had carved fine lines into her face and dusted gray through her hair, but her eyes were still sharp, still unwavering. "Jake." She didn't extend her hand. She just studied him, her gaze quick and thorough, the way it had been back in 2007. "You sure you want to be here?" "I've been here every day for 10 years, Jake said quietly. "Just never seen it." Jensen gave a small nod toward the lake. "We started setting up at dawn. The dive team from Fairbanks, cold water recovery specialists. They know what they're doing." Out on the ice, Jake saw men in thick neoprene suits kneeling by a dark, round opening. Ropes snaked across the frozen surface to the hole, where the divers moved deliberately, almost ritualistically. "How deep?" Jake asked. "About 12 feet, Jensen said. "Vehicles right at the edge of the drop-off into deeper water." She handed him a pair of binoculars. "See for yourself." Jake raised the lenses and found the hole in the ice. Through the glassy water, the teal roof of David's SUV emerged, unchanged after 10 long years. It sat upright on the lake bed, as though parked there by some unseen hand. The sight hit him like a hard punch beneath the ribs. "Jesus!" he breathed. "The ice preserved everything," Jensen murmured. "It's like they went in yesterday." Jake lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling. "Detective, I need to tell you something about why they were on this road." Jensen turned to him. "I'm listening." "David called me that morning," Jake said. "Asked about the road conditions. I told him to take the lake road." "You told me that 10 years ago," she said, her voice neutral. "I never told you why." He swallowed hard. "I'd never driven it. Never been to this lake. I only mentioned it because someone, God, I don't even remember who, had once said it was faster. It could have been a guy at work or some stranger in a bar. Back then, I was drinking a lot after Dad died. David called early. I was hungover. I just repeated something I'd heard." Jensen's brow furrowed. "So you don't remember where the advice came from?" "I don't. It was nothing, just words. But he trusted me, and I sent them here based on nothing." His voice cracked. 10 years of guilt, and that's the truth I've been hiding." "Why didn't you tell me in 2007? She asked after a pause. "Because I was ashamed. Because if you knew how careless I'd been, you'd blame me, the way I've blamed myself every day since." "Do you still?" Jake's eyes drifted back to the opening in the ice. "Every day." A sudden shout from the dive team broke the still air. One of the divers had surfaced, water streaming off his mask, and was waving urgently toward shore. Jensen unclipped her radio and lifted it to her mouth, her breath steaming in the February air. "Status?" The reply came back in a burst of static. "We've got a clear visual on the vehicle interior. All 4 occupants appear to be present." The word struck Jake like a body blow. For years he'd known it in the abstract, that his brother's family had gone into the lake together, but hearing it stated aloud made his knees threaten to buckle. "Any sign of trauma?" Jensen asked. A pause. "Hard to tell from this angle. We'll need to bring the vehicle up for a proper examination." Jensen lowered the radio and looked at him. "You don't have to watch this part." "Yes," Jake said, his voice low but certain. "I do." The recovery took 3 slow, grueling hours. Jake stayed at the tree line, the cold seeping through his boots, binoculars glued to his eyes. Out on the ice, divers worked with deliberate care, threading heavy steel cables under the SUV's frame. The portable crane moaned as its drum began to wind in the cable, the steel disappearing into the machinery. For long minutes, nothing happened. Just the occasional crackle over the radios and the muffled slap of water against the ice. Then the water in the dive hole began to stir, dark currents swirling up from below. Jake's chest tightened. He held his breath as the first gleam of teal broke the surface. The roof rose slowly, streaming water. The ski rack was still bolted in place, just as David had secured it that February morning, right down to the bungee cords and faded stickers. As the car emerged further, Jake could see shapes through the windows, 4 silhouettes in their seats, perfectly preserved by the cold. "Oh, God." The words slipped out before he could stop them. The crane lifted the SUV free of the water, swinging gently in the air. Chunks of ice clattered from the undercarriage, splintering across the lake's surface. The afternoon light revealed every detail. David was in the driver's seat, head bowed forward as if he'd simply dozed off. Sarah sat beside him, her winter coat zipped up to the chin. In the back, Katie and Tommy sat close together, looking smaller than Jake remembered, their stillness almost unbearable. "They're all here," Jake whispered, his throat tightening. "They're all here." Jensen stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jake, there's something else." She led him toward the recovery site. Up close, the preservation was haunting. Every fiber of clothing, every strand of hair frozen in place. But something was wrong. "Look at the windows," Jensen said. Jake leaned in. The driver's side window was cracked open about 3 inches. The passenger's side, too. "They tried to get out," Jensen said softly. "After the car went in." The thought made Jake's stomach churn. They'd been alive, conscious long enough to understand the danger. "Here," Jensen pointed again. Along the inside of the driver's door, deep scratches marred the fabric, narrow gouges torn into the material. "Fingernail marks," Jensen said. "Your brother fought to get out, but the water pressure, the cold shock, they didn't have time. In water this cold, hypothermia sets in within minutes, 2, maybe 3. Jake's gaze locked on those scratches. He could see David's hand in them, his final effort to save his family, to reverse the mistake of following his brother's advice. "There's more," Jensen said, moving toward the back of the vehicle. She gestured at the rear window. A spider web of cracks fanned out across the glass. But the pattern was wrong. "This isn't from impact damage," she said. "It's from the inside. Someone struck it hard, over and over, trying to break through." Jake pictured it. David or Sarah, or both, hammering at the glass with whatever they could find, while Katie and Tommy watched from inches away, their fear filling the small space. "Detective!" Jake's voice was raw. "How does a car end up in the middle of a lake? There's no road here, no ramp." Jensen's eyes narrowed. "I've been wondering the same thing. My guess? They were driving on the frozen surface. In February, that's not unheard of in Alaska. But the question is, was the ice thick enough?" She led him to a folding table where a weather station laptop glowed in the dim light. "Historical data," she said, scrolling. February 8th, 2007. Unusually warm. Daytime high hit 38 degrees. And the week before, warm spell, several days above freezing. Jake leaned in. "So the ice was already weakened." "Probably," Jensen said. "If they drove onto it thinking it was solid, it could have given way fast." She clicked on another set of records. "Now, look at this. Wind data. Sustained winds of 15 to 20 miles per hour that day, gusting to 30. In a whiteout, visibility would be almost nothing, she continued. But why would your brother take a car into a frozen lake in those conditions? Jake shook his head. He wouldn't. David was paranoid about ice, about winter driving in general. Then why was he out there? Jake's eyes went to the SUV, still dripping lake water, his family frozen inside. That question, why, had haunted him for 10 years. And now it carried a darker edge. Detective? His voice dropped. What if someone was chasing them? The words hung in the air. Jensen didn't dismiss them. Instead, she nodded slightly and gestured for him to follow. For the next hour, they walked the shoreline, boots crunching over snow crust. The access road was narrow, winding through thick spruce before opening onto a small clearing with a boat launch. In summer, Jensen explained, this was a busy fishing spot. Now it was silent, the air so still they could hear the groan of the ice far out on the lake. This is where they would have first seen the lake, Jensen said, stopping just before the tree line broke. Jake tried to picture it. David at the wheel, Sarah unfolding the map, Katie and Tommy bickering about something trivial in the back seat. A family in motion, completely unaware they were moments from disaster. The ice would have looked solid from here, Jake said quietly, especially with snow cover. Jensen nodded, her expression unreadable. Look at the shoreline, Jensen said, stopping just short of the tree line. She pointed toward faint impressions in the snow. They weren't fresh. Weather had softened their edges, but they also weren't a decade old. The lines were too crisp, the compacted snow too defined. Jake stepped closer. Tire tracks. More than one set, Jensen confirmed. Coming and going from the boat launch area. Whoever's been using this road, they've been doing it regularly. They followed the shallow ruts toward the lake. At the water's edge, where the frozen expanse would have stretched out wide in 2007, the tracks continued straight ahead, leading onto the place where ice had once been. Jake, Jensen said, crouching beside a weathered wooden post. Driven deep into the frozen ground, it leaned slightly, but had held its place for years. A metal sign was bolted to it, the paint bleached pale by sun and wind. Jake knelt to read it. Danger. Thin ice. No vehicles beyond this point. Jensen tapped the lower corner of the sign, where faintly stamped numbers marked the installation date. This was here in 2007. Jake's stomach tightened. Then David would have seen it. And David, cautious to the point of obsession about winter driving, would never have ignored it. He was the kind of man who double-checked weather reports and refused to drive at night in heavy snow. The thought of him passing that warning sign without a second glance was unthinkable. Unless, Jake realized with a cold flush, he hadn't had a choice. Someone made him, Jensen said, as if reading his thoughts. They kept moving along the lake's edge, boots crunching through layers of snow and ice. 50 yards from the launch, Jensen stopped again. There, half buried in the snow, partially concealed by the slow accumulation and melt of 10 winters, was a scrap of dull metal. Jensen brushed it clean with her gloved hand, revealing a license plate. Alaska tags, but not David's. The corrosion was heavy, but the numbers were still legible. HBZ847. Run it, Jake said immediately. Jensen was already on her radio, relaying the sequence to the state police database. Minutes later, the reply came back. Registered to a 2005 Ford pickup, owner Harlan McBride. The name landed like a fist to Jake's ribs. Hawk McBride. You know him? Jake nodded slowly. Worked with him at the railroad. Freight coordinator. Knew every back road in the state. His mind was spinning now, memories clicking into place. Hawk McBride. The quiet man with the ever-present baseball cap, the one who liked to offer advice about shortcuts and scenic routes. And then it slammed into him, clear and undeniable. He's the one who told me about the lake road. You're sure? Jensen's voice was sharp now. I remember. It was in the break room, maybe a week before David called. Hawk said the Copperhead Lake route was faster than the highway. Prettier, cut 20 minutes off the drive to Anchorage. Jensen glanced from the rusted plate to the faded warning sign, her eyes narrowing. So McBride feeds you false information, and then he's here the night your brother's family vanishes. The question is, why? Before Jake could answer, Jensen's radio burst to life. Detective Jensen, Officer Mitchell, at the recovery site. You need to get back here. We found something inside the vehicle. They hurried back across the snow, their breath clouding in the cold. The teal SUV now sat on a flatbed trailer, its tires dripping lake water onto the frozen ground. Crime scene techs moved with methodical precision, photographing and cataloging every angle before opening the doors. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, holding an evidence bag. Inside was a small black object. Found this wedged under the driver's seat. Through the plastic, Jake saw it clearly. An older model cell phone, the kind common in 2007. That's not David's, he said. His phone was never recovered. Jensen examined it, her expression hardening. Burner phone, prepaid, untraceable. David wouldn't have a burner, Jake said. No, Jensen agreed. Which means someone else put it there. She turned it in her hands. Through the cloudy plastic, the screen was still visible. The last call in the log showed a date and time, February 8th, 2007, 3:42 p.m. That's about when they would have reached the lake, Jensen said quietly. The question is, who was he calling? Her radio crackled again, this time the voice of a tech still working inside the SUV. Detective, you need to see this. We found something else. Jensen and Jake approached the driver's side. The tech had the door open, pointing toward the floor mat. Lying there were several plastic zip ties, cut through the middle. Like someone's hands were bound, the tech said. And then freed. Jake stared at them, his breath fogging in the cold air. They were kidnapped. Looks that way, Jensen said. Jake's voice was low, heavy with realization. They took my brother's family, brought them here, forced them onto the ice. Jensen moved around to the passenger side and looked through the window at the preserved scene inside. And then what? Just let them drive into the lake? No, Jake said, the answer blooming in his mind with terrible clarity. They made David drive out there. Probably held a gun on them. Told him to keep going or they'd kill Sarah and the kids. The scene was almost visible to him now. David gripping the wheel, Sarah's terrified eyes, the children pressed back against their seats. Whoever was with them knew the ice wouldn't hold. It was execution, Jake said, voice hard. Execution disguised as an accident. Jensen's phone rang. She turned away to answer, listening for a moment before her face paled. That was the lab, she said when she hung up. They lifted prints off the burner phone. Her eyes locked on Jake's. They belong to Harlan McBride. For a moment, Jake couldn't speak. The last decade of guilt, the crushing belief that his casual advice had doomed his family, twisted into something new and sharper. Rage. 10 years, he said. 10 years, I thought I'd killed them. And all along, someone was using me. Where is he? Jake demanded. Jensen pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly. According to DMV records, he's 20 miles from here. Rural address. Let's go. Jake, this is police business. You can't... He used me to kill my family, Jake said, his voice flat and cold. I'm going to ask him why. Jensen studied his face for a long moment, reading the unshakable determination there. It was the same determined set to the jaw Jake remembered seeing on David years ago. The look his brother wore when he'd made up his mind to do the right thing, no matter the cost. We go together, Jensen said finally. And we do this by the book. Jake nodded, but the promise he was making in his own head was different. Hawk, McBride had spent 10 years walking free, no remorse, convinced he'd outsmarted everyone. That illusion was about to shatter. Beyond them, the sinking sun bled over the jagged horizon, casting long cold shadows across Copperhead Lake. Jake knew this light. He'd seen it 10 years earlier, the day David's family took their final breath beneath the ice. This time, though, the setting sun wasn't closing the chapter. It was signaling the beginning of the reckoning. He turned once more to look at the teal SUV resting on the flatbed, its every dent and scratch preserved as if it had been waiting all this time to tell the truth. "I'm sorry, David," he whispered. "I should have figured it out sooner." As he and Jensen walked toward her cruiser, a single thought looped in Jake's mind. Maybe this time he could finally set something right. Harlan McBride's home was buried deep in the wilderness, at the far end of a gravel road that twisted upward in 20 miles of narrow switchbacks. The deeper they drove into the forest, the heavier the silence became, broken only by the crunch of tires on frozen gravel and the muted chatter of the police radio. Jake sat in the passenger seat, his hands locked together in his lap. Every turn seemed to squeeze the air from his lungs, his stomach tightening with the same unease he imagined David must have felt on his last drive. McBride had played him, fed him the Copperhead Lake route like bait, knowing Jake would pass it along without question. Premeditated murder disguised as an offhand bit of friendly advice. "You okay?" Jensen asked without taking her eyes from the road. Jake gave a low, humorless laugh. "I keep thinking about all the nights I sat in my cabin, drinking until I couldn't stand, blaming myself, convinced I'd killed them with one careless suggestion." "You couldn't have known," she said firmly. "Couldn't I?" Jake's voice was quiet, but there was a hard edge in it. "I recommended a road I'd never driven, based on the word of a man I barely knew. That's not innocent. That's careless enough to get someone killed." Jensen didn't argue, but her eyes flicked toward him before returning to the twisting road. The cruiser slowed as they approached a rusted mailbox, the name H. McBride painted in faded white letters. Beyond it, 2 deep tire ruts disappeared into a wall of trees. "Jake," she said evenly, "when we get in there, let me do the talking. This is a homicide investigation now. I need everything we hear to hold up in court." Jake nodded, though his jaw stayed locked tight. He'd waited 10 years for the chance to face the man who had stolen his family. Words weren't what he planned to give. McBride's property came into view. A small, weather-beaten house crouched in the center of a yard, littered with the kind of debris that told its own story. 2 old trucks rusting into the earth, boat trailers leaning on flat tires, stacks of machinery hidden under tarps, stiff with age. The air here felt heavy, as if the place itself wanted strangers gone. Jensen eased the cruiser beside a newer pickup truck, a 2015 Ford. Its license plate read HBZ948, close enough to the one they'd found at the lake that Jake didn't need convincing it belonged to the same man. "He's home," Jensen said. They stepped out together, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. Jensen kept her right hand near her holster, not drawn, but ready. Professional caution, honed by years of walking into unpredictable situations. From inside, faint movement caught Jake's attention, shadows shifting, the muted thud of footsteps. Somewhere in the house, a television clicked off. He could feel the eyes on them, watching through the glass. Jensen knocked firmly. "Mr. McBride, Alaska State Police. We'd like to speak with you." A long moment passed before the door creaked open. Harlan Hawk McBride filled the frame. Older now, hair streaked with gray, but the sharpness in his gaze was the same. He wore a flannel shirt and worn jeans, work boots caked with old mud. His eyes slid from Jensen to Jake, pausing just long enough for something to flicker. Recognition, then a shift to calculation. "Jake Whitford," Hawk said. His voice was exactly as Jake remembered, quiet, deliberate, offering nothing. "Heard on the news they pulled your brother's car out of Copperhead." "Mr. McBride," Jensen said, flashing her badge. "Detective Sarah Jensen, Alaska State Police. We're investigating the deaths of the Whitford family. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Hawk stepped back, gesturing into the house. "Come in, I guess. Don't see how I can help you. That was 10 years ago." Inside, the house was clean but sparse. The furniture was solid and well used, the kind that had been in place for decades. Hunting and fishing photos lined the walls, Hawk with his arm around men Jake didn't recognize, grinning over gutted salmon, standing beside racks of caribou antlers. It was the home of a man content to be forgotten. "You worked with Jake at the railroad in 2007, Jensen began, taking a seat across from Hawk. "That's right," Hawk said easily. "Freight coordination. Jake was maintenance crew." "Did you and Jake ever discuss driving routes? Back roads, shortcuts, scenic options?" Hawk's eyes flicked to Jake for the briefest moment before returning to Jensen. "Sure. Guys talk about all kinds of things on long shifts, roads, fishing spots, and weather. You pass the time. Do you remember telling Jake about the Copperhead Lake route?" There was the faintest pause. Too long for a man with nothing to hide. "Might have," Hawk said finally. "I knew a lot of roads back then." Jake leaned forward, unable to hold his tongue. "You told me it was faster than the highway. You said it cut 20 minutes off the drive to Anchorage." Hawk's expression didn't change, but his gaze locked on Jake's. "Did I? Hard to remember casual talk from 10 years back." "It wasn't casual," Jake shot back, his voice rising. "You made a point of it. Told me it was prettier, faster. You wanted me to remember." "Jake," Jensen warned quietly. But Hawk's lips curled into a thin smile, a cold expression that stopped short of his eyes. "Your brother made his own choices, Jake. Nobody forced him to drive onto that ice." He tilted his head slightly. "Did they?" Jensen reached into her bag and withdrew an evidence bag. Inside was the burner phone, its black casing dulled with age, the screen still cracked from the years underwater. Jensen's voice was steady as she placed the evidence bag on the table between them. "We found this in David Whitford's SUV. Your fingerprints are all over it." For the first time, the faint, smug curve in Hawk McBride's mouth disappeared. His eyes narrowed. "I've never seen that phone before." "Your prints say otherwise," Jensen replied. "This phone made a call at 3:42 p.m., February 8th, 2007, right around the time the Whitford family reached Copperhead Lake." Hawk didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the phone like he was trying to calculate the exact angle of escape. "You want to tell us about that call?" Jensen asked. "I want to call my lawyer," Hawk said finally, his voice flat. "That's your right," Jensen acknowledged. "But Mr. McBride, we also found your license plate at the lake. HBZ 847. Want to explain how it got there?" Hawk pushed himself out of his chair. "I think this conversation's over." "Sit down," Jensen ordered, her hand shifting toward her holstered weapon. "We're not done." But Jake had already risen, years of rage and grief boiling over. 10 years of carrying the weight alone, believing that his careless advice had sent his brother's family to their deaths, had all funneled into this moment. "You used me," Jake said, stepping toward Hawk, his voice trembling with fury. "You fed me lies so I'd send them to die." "Jake, back off," Jensen warned, but he barely heard her. Hawk's right hand slid toward a drawer beneath the kitchen counter. "Don't," Jensen snapped, drawing her weapon. "Hands where I can see them." But Hawk's fingers closed around something and pulled it free. Not a gun, but a worn manila folder. He tossed it onto the kitchen table. "You want to know why?" Hawk said coldly. "Look at that." Jensen approached with caution, her pistol still trained on him. She flipped the folder open with her free hand. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one nearly identical. Images of trucks dumping heavy barrels into Copperhead Lake. The pictures captured company logos on the doors, chemical hazard symbols on the containers, and the sheen of oily liquid spilling onto the ice. "Industrial waste," Jensen murmured. "Hazardous waste disposal," Hawk corrected smugly. 50 grand a load. I was making more in a month than the railroad paid in a year. Jake stared at the images, his stomach tightening. "You were poisoning the lake." "I was providing a service," Hawk said. "Companies in Fairbanks, Anchorage, and even Seattle. They all had toxic waste they couldn't dispose of legally. I made their problems disappear." Jensen's eyes were hard as she flipped through the stack. "How long?" 3 years, Hawk said without hesitation. Would have been longer, but your brother had to stick his nose in. Jake felt the pieces locking into place. David saw you dumping. February 7th, Hawk confirmed. I was making a late run. Thought the lake was empty. But there's your brother, parked at the tree line with his fancy camera, taking pictures of my operation. His tone was almost conversational, as if he were explaining an inconvenience in a shipping schedule. I tried to reason with him, Hawk continued. Offered him cash to keep his mouth shut. Jake's jaw tightened. And he got all righteous, said he was going to report it to the EPA, so you killed him, Jake said. I defended my business interests, Hawk replied without a flicker of remorse. Simple as that. Jensen was already speaking into her radio, calling for backup, but Jake's focus had tunneled in on Hawk. How? He demanded. How did you do it? Hawk's mouth twisted into a grin again. Easy. I knew David would call you for road advice. You were always the little brother who knew shortcuts. So I planted the idea about the lake road weeks in advance. Made sure you'd recommend it without thinking. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Then I waited at the lake, Hawk went on. When David's family arrived, I told them they were under arrest for trespassing on a federal investigation site. Showed them fake badges, zip-tied their hands, loaded them into their own vehicle. Jake's vision blurred with rage. You made David drive onto the ice. I told him to drive straight across, or I'd shoot his wife and kids, Hawk said. The ice was already weakened from the warm weather. I knew it wouldn't hold an SUV. He had a choice, refuse and watch me kill them quickly, or try to make it across. Hawk shrugged. Poor judgment. Jake lunged. He slammed into Hawk with the force of 10 years of pain, driving him back against the counter. Jake, stop! Jensen shouted, but her voice barely registered. Jake's hands locked around Hawk's throat. The older man's eyes widened, but even with his windpipe compressed, there was calculation in his gaze, like he was still assessing the odds. Jensen grabbed Jake's shoulders, pulling hard. He's not worth it, Jake. Let the courts handle this. Jake squeezed harder, his own breath ragged. Hawk's skin was turning mottled, his lips purpling. Then Hawk choked out 4 words that froze Jake where he stood. They're not all dead. Jake's grip faltered. What did you say? Hawk gasped for air, rubbing his neck where dark finger marks were already forming. I said they're not all dead. Jensen's weapon was trained on both men now. Jake, step back, now! But Jake's feet felt rooted to the floor. That's impossible, he said. We saw the bodies, all 4 of them. Hawk's terrible smile returned. You saw what you expected to see. But did you count? Did you really look? Jensen stepped forward, gun unwavering. Explain, now. Hawk moved to the kitchen window, gazing out at the dense forest like the answer was written there. Your brother was a problem, but his wife and kids? They were leveraging. Jake's voice was hoarse. Leverage for what? David saw my operation, started taking pictures. I couldn't let him report it. But killing an entire family? That's messy. Brings federal heat, media swarms. Too much attention for a business like mine to survive. Jake's stomach twisted violently. If Hawk was telling the truth, if one of them had survived, then the last 10 years had been built on a lie even worse than he imagined. Jake's voice was low but sharp. So, you kept them alive. Hawk's reply came without hesitation. I kept the woman and the boy alive. The girl. He let the words hang just long enough to make Jake's chest seize. She tried to run that first night, made too much noise. Jake felt the air leave his lungs. Katie, 17, full of restless energy. Terrified and alone, bolting for the woods in the dark. You killed her. Hawk shrugged, unbothered. She made her choice. Jensen's radio crackled, dispatch feeding her an update. Backup was still 10 minutes away. For Jake, 10 minutes might as well have been 10 years. He couldn't wait that long, couldn't even wait 10 seconds. Where are they? Jake demanded, stepping forward. Where are Sarah and Tommy? Safe, federal, warm. Hawk's smile widened. For now? Jake pressed. That, Hawk said. Depends on you, Jake. I've been watching the news, watching this whole investigation unfold, and I've realized something. Jensen's voice cut in, cold and precise. What have you realized? Hawk's tone shifted, almost casual. That I have an opportunity here. Jake's eyes narrowed. You want to make a deal. I want everyone to get what they want, Hawk said smoothly. I tell you where the woman and boy are, and you walk away from the dumping investigation. Jensen stepped closer, her weapon steady. They've been prisoners for 10 years. That's kidnapping. Unlawful imprisonment. They've been guests, Hawk corrected. Well-treated guests. They know the rules and the consequences of breaking them. Jake's thoughts spun, colliding. Sarah, alive. Tommy, alive. For a decade, their deaths had been his private nightmare, his burden. And now Hawk was telling him they were real, breathing, living people. Prove it, Jake said. Hawk moved to another drawer, slower this time under Jensen's watchful aim. He withdrew a digital camera, powered it on, and turned the display toward them. The first image appeared. A small cabin nestled in dense forest, the snow piled high against its walls. It was basic but clean. A wood stove, a couple of chairs on the porch, a line of chopped logs stacked neatly along one side. The next image made Jake's knees feel unsteady. Sarah sat at a kitchen table, older and thinner. But it was her, no question. Her blonde hair was streaked with gray, her face lined by years that had stolen more than just time. But her eyes were bright. The third image was of a young man outside the cabin, splitting firewood. Tall, lean, dark-haired, the spitting image of David at that age. Tommy, Hawk said, 18 now, grew up in that cabin. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered. Recent photos, Hawk said. Taken last week. They're healthy, fed content. Content? Jake's voice cracked. They're prisoners. They're survivors, Hawk said evenly. And they'll keep surviving as long as the deal stays in place. Jensen's weapon never wavered. Where's the cabin? About 30 miles from here, Hawk replied. Remote, off-grid. They have everything except freedom, and freedom's overrated. Jake's eyes stayed on the camera. Sarah's face was older, worn down, but there was something else, something defiant in her gaze. She's been planning, Jake said quietly. Hawk frowned. Planning what? Escape, Jake answered. She's just been waiting for the right moment. That's impossible, Hawk said. 15 miles from the nearest road, nothing but dense forest, no trails, no landmarks. Even if they made it out, they'd freeze before anyone found them. But Jake knew Sarah, knew her stubborn streak, her will to fight for her son. If Tommy was alive, Sarah would never stop trying to save him. Detective, Jake said, we need to get to that cabin now. Not until backup arrives, Jensen began. The forest itself seemed to interrupt her. A sharp, distant crack echoed through the trees. The unmistakable report of gunfire. Hawk's face drained of color. That came from the cabin's direction, Jensen said. Another shot followed, then silence. Hawk stepped toward the door. If something happens to them, you get nothing. No evidence, no witnesses, no case. Jake grabbed his arm. Who else knows about the cabin? No one, just me. Then who's shooting? Hawk's answer was swallowed by a deep, rolling boom, an explosion far enough to muffle but strong enough to rattle the windows. The cabin, Hawk said, his voice hollow. Someone just blew up the cabin. Jensen's radio came alive with her calling for fire, medical, and tactical response. Jake didn't wait. He was already moving toward the door. For 10 years, Sarah and Tommy had been ghosts in his mind, people he mourned but couldn't bury. Now, in a matter of minutes, they had been ripped back into reality, only to be thrown into mortal danger again. At the threshold, Jake stopped and turned back to Hawk. Who else was involved in the dumping operation? Hawk hesitated. You didn't do this alone, Jake pressed. Hazardous waste disposal, federal crimes. You had partners. Who were they? Hawk's silence was its own confession. They're cleaning house, Jake said. Getting rid of witnesses. No, Hawk said sharply. They don't know. A second explosion cut him off, closer this time. The floor seemed to shiver beneath their feet. Everyone in the car, Jensen ordered. They moved fast, Jake in the passenger seat, Hawk zip-tied in the back. Jensen's cruiser roared to life, sirens screaming as they tore down the forest road. How do we get to the cabin? Jensen demanded. North Logging Road, Hawk said. About 20 miles, then a hiking trail. Can we drive it? Not in this, Hawk replied. Too narrow. Jake's eyes flicked to the speedometer. 60 miles an hour on gravel. The trees whipped by like fence posts, the tires spitting loose stone. Detective, Jake said. What if we're too late? Then we're too late, Jensen said, her knuckles white on the wheel. But we're still going. In the back seat, Hawk stared out at the rushing trees, his voice dropping low. They were never supposed to be heard. The deal was simple. Stay hidden, stay quiet, stay alive. What deal? Jensen asked, not taking her eyes off the road. People who paid me to make problems disappear, Hawk said. People who don't like loose ends. Jake felt the ice settle in his gut. How long have they known about Sarah and Tommy? They didn't, Hawk said. I never told them the family survived. Then how did they find out? Jake's voice was tight, almost shaking. Hawk leaned forward, catching Jake's eyes in the rearview mirror. Someone's been watching, following the investigation. They probably figured it out the moment you started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. Jake felt the words like a punch in the ribs. By chasing the truth about David's death, he had painted a target on the very people he thought he was trying to save. The family he'd mourned for a decade, alive this whole time, might now die because he had stirred the water. His throat tightened. Drive faster. Jensen didn't argue. Her foot sank into the accelerator, the cruiser leaping forward. The forest blurred past, dark trunks whipping by like bars on a cage. Somewhere far ahead, above the black pines, a thin column of smoke was beginning to rise. The logging road narrowed, funneling into a steel gate bound with a heavy chain. A sun-bleached sign hung crooked. No trespassing, private property. Beyond, a ribbon of dirt vanished into dense forest. Jensen killed the engine. In the sudden stillness, the world felt close, claustrophobic. The low crackle of flames reached them, underscored by the occasional sharp pop of burning timber. The air already smelled faintly of smoke. How far to the cabin? Jensen asked without looking back. 2 miles, maybe, Hawk answered. But the trail's rough, 30 minutes on foot, minimum. Jake was already moving, eyes on the chain. We need bolt cutters. I've got something better. Jensen popped the trunk and pulled out a crowbar, the steel worn smooth from years of use. Stand back. She jammed the bar between the chain and the gate post, putting her whole weight into it. Metal groaned, then snapped with a sharp metallic ping that echoed in the trees. They moved quickly up the trail. Jensen first, weapon drawn. Jake close behind, Hawk trailing with his wrists still cinched in zip ties. The path was narrow and uneven, a hunter's route rather than a road, hemmed in by spruce and pine whose branches clawed at their jackets. Beneath the snow, hidden roots and loose rock made every step a risk. The air grew heavier with each yard, the smell of burning wood growing thicker, sharper. Who else knew about this place? Jensen asked as they climbed. Nobody, Hawk said between breaths. Built it myself. No permits, no inspections. But someone found it, Jake said grimly. Someone who knew exactly why Sarah and Tommy were still breathing. His thoughts were churning, threads of the last 10 years tangling into a darker weave. The dumping, the murders, the cover-up. It was all too clean to be one man's doing. Hawk, Jake said. Who paid you for the waste? Names Hawk was breathing heavier now, sweat cutting shiny tracks through the dirt on his forehead despite the February cold. Different outfits, medical facilities in Fairbanks, mining companies, a chemical plant in Anchorage. Be specific, Jensen pressed, stopping in her tracks. Northland Medical, Hawk admitted. Biggest client. Paid the best for special disposal. Jake froze mid-step. Vincent Torres's company. You know Torres? Hawk asked, almost surprised. Jensen's voice was flat. We know of him. What else? Arctic Mining Solutions, Fairbanks Industrial Cleaning, some smaller names. Hawk hesitated, then added, but Torres, he was the money. He coordinated the runs, picked the sites. Everything went through him. Jake could feel the puzzle locking into place. So when we started poking around the lake, Torres saw the whole operation at risk. More than that, Jensen said. If Sarah and Tommy testify, Torres isn't just looking at environmental crimes. He's tied to kidnapping, conspiracy, murder. Which means, Jake said, he'd do anything to erase them. They crested a ridge. Ahead, through the bare winter branches, a thick column of smoke curled into the gray sky, darker than wildfire smoke, oily, rolling. We're close, Hawk said, his voice tight now. Jensen tried back up again, but the response came back the same, 20 minutes out. She glanced at Jake. We go careful, no heroics. But as they broke through the last line of trees, Jake saw there was no careful left to be had. The cabin was a furnace, flames devouring what was left of the walls, the roof already collapsed. Smoke churned and billowed, the heat slamming into Jake's skin even from the tree line. Sarah! He shouted, sprinting forward. Jake, stop! Jensen's voice cracked like a whip. It's not stable! But he pulled free, circling wide, searching for any break in the flames, any movement, any sound that might be them. The air was thick with smoke, choking his lungs. Behind the structure, something caught his eye. Tire tracks pressed into the snow. Fresh. More than one vehicle. Jensen, over here! She came at a run, crouching beside him. Two distinct sets of prints led away from the cabin toward another narrow trail. They got out, Jake said, his chest hammering. Or someone took them, Jensen countered. Hawk stumbled up behind them, panting. That trail, it connects to an old mining road. Where does it go? Jensen demanded. Eventually hits the highway, Hawk said. But there's a maze of spurs, abandoned camps, hunting cabins. Easy to get lost. Jensen was already on her radio, pushing descriptions out to any unit within 50 miles, requesting roadblocks, checkpoints. Jake knew in his gut they were late. Whoever had taken Sarah and Tommy had a head start and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Hawk, Jake said, turning on him. If Torres wanted them dead, where would he take them? I don't know. This wasn't part of the plan. What was the plan? Jensen's voice was sharp. Hawk's eyes flicked to the burning cabin. Keep them hidden until the statute of limitations ran out on the dumping charges, then maybe send them somewhere far away. That statute's 7 years, Jensen said. It expired 3 years ago. Jake's voice was like ground glass. So why keep them alive? Hawk's answer was quiet, almost defensive. Insurance. As long as they were breathing, I had leverage on Torres. If he tried to cut me out, you were blackmailing him, Jake said, the disgust raw in his voice. I was protecting my business. Hawk's eyes met Jake's without flinching. By keeping your sister-in-law and nephew alive when Torres would have buried them in a shallow grave a decade ago. Before Jake could reply, a sound rolled across the clearing. A low, heavy thump, unmistakably mechanical. It wasn't over. Yet. The thump of helicopter rotors reached them first. Low, fast, cutting through the winter air from the south. That's not ours, Jensen said, already checking her radio. The clipped static confirmed it. Backup is still ground-based. The black shape rose over the tree line moments later, sleek, unmarked, moving with the deliberate precision of a bird of prey. It circled the burning cabin once, slowly, assessing, before dipping toward the clearing and flaring for landing. Snow and ash kicked into the air in a furious swirl as the skids touched down. Two men in tactical gear stepped out, their rifles up and ready. "Hands visible," one barked, his voice carrying over the dying roar of the rotors. Jensen had her badge out in an instant, her service weapon lowered but not relaxed. "Alaska State Police, identify yourselves." "Private security," the lead man called back, his stance rigid. "We're here to secure a crime scene." "Whose crime scene?" "Vincent Torres has a legal interest in this property." Jake's chest tightened, a familiar, hot anger rising fast. Torres's men, not here to help, here to erase. "Where are the prisoners?" Jake shouted before he could stop himself. The man's visor tilted toward him. "What prisoners?" "Sarah and Tommy Whitford," Jake said. "They were being held here." The man's answer was flat. "Sir, we were told this was an abandoned structure used for illegal activities. No mention of prisoners." Jensen stepped forward, her voice cutting like ice. "Detective Sarah Jensen, Alaska State Police. This is an active homicide investigation. You will stand down." The team leader's head tilted, listening to something in his earpiece, words Jake couldn't catch. "Detective, we have orders to secure this site until federal investigators arrive." "What federal investigators?" Jensen demanded. "EPA, FBI. We were informed this site is connected to an environmental crime." Jake understood instantly. Torres wasn't just wiping the slate clean. He was wrapping it in red tape. The EPA and FBI presence, real or faked, would shift the focus entirely onto the dumping operation. Any evidence that Sarah and Tommy had spent a decade here would vanish into ongoing investigations and closed files. "They're not here to help," Jake said under his breath. "They're here to make sure Sarah and Tommy disappear." Jensen's hand hovered near her weapon. "Sir, I'm ordering you to leave this scene now." The man didn't flinch. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Detective." The air between them felt brittle, stretched thin. Two armed groups, both claiming authority, neither backing down. Then Hawk McBride made his move. With his wrists still zip-tied, he bolted for the tree line, crashing through the undergrowth like a startled animal. "Stop!" Jensen shouted. One of Torres's men didn't hesitate. His rifle came up, a single, sharp report, cracked through the clearing, and Hawk went down face first into the snow. "Jesus Christ," Jensen breathed. The team leader spoke into his radio. "Target down, scene secure." Jake stared at Hawk's body. 10 years of guilt, and the one man who might have led him to Sarah and Tommy was bleeding out in the snow. Now the search stretched from a pinpoint on a map to thousands of square miles of Alaskan wilderness. "Detective Jensen," the team leader said calmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to vacate. This is now a federal crime scene." But Jake barely heard him. Sarah and Tommy had been alive less than an hour ago. He wasn't going to let them vanish into shadow again. Not after 10 years. While Jensen was still arguing jurisdiction, demanding credentials, Jake slipped sideways into the tree line, moving low and fast. The fresh tire tracks cutting through the snow were clear. 2 vehicles, heavy. He followed, the cold biting into his lungs with each breath. Behind him, Jensen's voice rose, still locked in verbal combat with Torres's men. The tracks led to a broader trail, then spilled onto a gravel road. One Hawk had called the old mining access route. Here, the story unfolded in the snow. Boot prints, scattered cigarette butts, the churn of tires after a stop. Then the paths diverged. One vehicle had turned north toward the main highway. The other veered east, deeper into the backcountry. Jake knelt, studying the ruts. The eastbound vehicle was riding lower, the tires biting deep. It was heavy. Heavy with passengers. He pulled out his phone, called Jensen. "Where the hell are you?" she answered, the sound of urgency in her voice. "Following the tracks. They split at the mining road, one north, one east. Jake, get back here. We need to coordinate with—" "No time. Sarah and Tommy are in the eastbound vehicle. I can feel it." "You can't track armed men alone. Wait for backup." Jake's eyes followed the narrow road disappearing into the timber. "Detective, those federal agents aren't federal. They work for Torres, and they just murdered the only witness who could tell us where my family is." "I know. I'm calling the real FBI, but by the time they untangle the paperwork, they'll be dead," Jake finished for her. He killed the call, switched off the phone. He couldn't risk Torres's men tracing the signal. The eastbound track looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades, pitted, overgrown, hemmed in by forest so thick it seemed to swallow the daylight. A road hunters and trappers used once upon a time, a road you could vanish down and never come back. Jake adjusted his pack straps, took one last glance back toward the column of smoke, and stepped forward. Every minute counted now. The trail twisted like a vein through the dense Alaskan forest, winding upward toward the dark silhouettes of the mountains. The snow was deep in places, crunching softly under Jake's boots as he pushed forward at a steady jog. His breath came in short clouds, white against the icy air, each exhale a reminder of the clock ticking in his head. The tire tracks ahead of him were clear, still sharp at the edges, meaning the vehicle had passed not long ago. Every few minutes, Jake stopped, holding his breath, straining to hear over the sound of his own heartbeat. Sometimes he thought he caught the faint echo of an engine somewhere ahead, but the forest swallowed sound quickly here. After what felt like an hour, but was probably less, he came upon a break in the pattern. The vehicle had stopped. Snow was churned under the tires, boot prints scattered around. Jake crouched low, scanning. That's when he saw it. Splashes of color against the untouched white. Drops of blood. Fresh, bright crimson. He knelt, studying the pattern. Not a spray, not pooling, just a trail of individual drops. The kind of bleeding that came from a cut to the head, maybe a gash across the scalp. The droplets stretched away from the tire tracks, angling toward a shadowed shape up ahead. Through the trees, he could see the dull outlines of weathered buildings, 3 in total, huddled together in a clearing like relics of another era. It was an old mining camp, the kind that might have bustled with life 50 years ago but now stood half-forgotten, hidden deep in the wilderness. A main structure that could have been a bunkhouse. A smaller, squat building, probably an equipment shed. And off to the side, a narrow shack with a tin roof that looked like it might house a generator. Smoke curled lazily from the bunkhouse chimney, thin and gray against the pale winter sky. Someone was inside. Jake stayed low, circling wide through the tree cover, his eyes scanning for movement. He counted no sentries posted outside, no visible tripwires or motion sensors, but the place wasn't abandoned. Behind the equipment shed, he found a black SUV half buried in snowdrift. Mud caked the plates so thick the numbers were unreadable. Only one vehicle. Either the others had already left, or this wasn't where Sarah and Tommy had been taken. But the blood trail told him otherwise. It led straight to the front door of the bunkhouse. He crept closer, using the side of the shed as cover. Through a grimy window, Jake got his first glimpse inside. 2 men in heavy winter gear stood near a wood stove, steam rising faintly from their coats. One cradled a rifle, methodically cleaning the barrel. The other had a satellite phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, clipped tones. And against the far wall, hands zip-tied in front of them, sat 2 people. Sarah. Her hair was still blonde, though streaked now with silver, her face lined and pale. Her coat was patched in several places, the kind of garment that had been mended over and over. Even from here, Jake could see the dried blood at her temple, a dark crust marking where the skin had split. She looked exhausted, but not broken. Her eyes moved constantly, following her captors, measuring, waiting. Next to her sat a young man, tall and lean, the sharp planes of his face unmistakably his father's. Tommy. 10 years older, his jaw harder, his eyes darker, but still carrying the stubborn set Jake remembered from when he was 8. Even bound, he sat like a coiled spring, tension radiating from him. Jake's chest constricted. 10 years of guilt, grief, and unanswered questions condensed into the sight of these 2 people breathing before him. The guards were armed and relaxed. their posture telling him they didn't expect trouble this far out. That was their mistake. Circling to the rear of the bunkhouse, Jake found a secondary entrance, a narrow, weather-warped door, probably leading to a kitchen or storage area. The lock was ancient, rust having eaten through the metal. He worked at it with his pocket knife until the mechanism gave with a reluctant click. Inside, the air was warmer, the smell of burning wood and cooked meat hanging thick. Voices carried from the main room. "Supposed to be here in an hour," one man said. "Then we torch the place and head back." "What about the bodies?" "Boss wants them found eventually. Make it look like they were hiding out. Died in a fire." "Accident." The second man gave a short laugh. 10 years in hiding and they just happened to die the same week the cops come sniffing around. Not our problem. Jake's jaw tightened. He scanned the storage room. Old mining gear covered in dust, lengths of chain, rusted tools. In the corner sat 2 dented containers of lamp oil. His eyes flicked toward the generator shack outside. The old wood siding would catch in seconds. Working fast, he carried the containers to the back door and poured the oil in a broad arc around the shack's base. The smell was sharp in the cold air. One strike of a match and the liquid whooshed to life, flames licking hungrily up the weathered boards. Within moments, the fire roared louder, the dry timber feeding it eagerly. "What the hell?" a voice barked from inside. "Generator's on fire! If it hits the fuel tank!" Boots thudded. Both guards bolted for the back door, rifles at the ready, shouting to each other as they moved. Jake slipped into the main room the moment they were gone. Sarah's head lifted. When her eyes found him, they went wide, then filled instantly with tears. "Jake," she whispered, disbelief and relief tangled in her voice. "It's me." He knelt, cutting through her bindings with quick, practiced slices. Then he moved to Tommy. Up close, the resemblance to David was almost painful, right down to the defiant tilt of his chin. "Uncle Jake," Tommy said quietly. "Mom said you'd come someday." Jake's throat felt tight. "We need to move, now." He ushered them toward the storage room, the fire outside roaring louder now, crackling in the freezing air. Shouts echoed from the yard. "Fuel tanks! Gonna blow! Get the truck!" Perfect. In the chaos, they could slip away. But as they reached the back, another sound cut through. The low, unmistakable growl of engines. More than one. Headlights flared through the trees, bouncing along the frozen trail. Torres's reinforcements had arrived. Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "This way." He led them to a busted window at the rear of the storage room. Glass crunched under their boots as they climbed out into the snow, the forest closing around them like a shield. Behind them, vehicles pulled into the camp, their engines idling like predators waiting for the kill. They were close. Too close. "Can you run?" Jake asked, scanning the dark stretch of forest ahead. Sarah's eyes burned with something deeper than fear. Resolve. "I've been waiting 10 years to run," she said. They moved into the cover of the trees, the ground muffled under snow, each step sinking with a soft crunch. Branches clawed at their coats, the bitter air stung their faces, but the forest swallowed them quickly, wrapping them in shadows. Behind them, the shouts began. Men calling to each other, their words sharp with command. Vehicles roared, headlights cutting through the drifting smoke from the burning camp. Somewhere in the mix came the barking, short, eager bursts from the search dogs. For the first time in a decade, they were moving together, free from locked doors and armed guards. Jake felt the weight of that. But freedom bought in flight was fragile, and it could vanish as quickly as it had come. They pushed hard for nearly 20 minutes before Sarah stumbled against a fallen log, catching herself on the bark before sliding to her knees. Her breath came in jagged gasps, steam pouring into the cold air. "I can't," she panted. "Need to rest." Jake dropped to a knee beside her, his gloves brushing away strands of hair to check the cut on her forehead. It was still bleeding, sluggish but steady. "What happened?" he asked quietly. One of Torres's men hit me with his rifle butt, she said. Her voice was hoarse, the edges worn by years of speaking only when necessary. I tried to shield Tommy. Tommy was at her side instantly, jaw tight, his body angled between her and the direction they'd come from. They killed Hawk this morning, he said flatly. Shot him right in front of us. Jake exchanged a quick glance with Sarah. We know, he said. You were there? Sarah's brow furrowed, confusion knitting across her face. How did you find us? Jake offered her his water bottle, steadying her hand as she drank. We found David's SUV under the ice at Copperhead Lake. Her expression broke, and her shoulders slumped as the truth hit. David's really dead. Yeah, Jake said softly. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. She nodded slowly, tears freezing on her lashes. I knew. I saw them shoot him. But for 10 years, I kept hoping. Maybe. Her voice trailed off. Tommy's arm came around her shoulders. At 18, he still carried the fierce instinct to protect his mother, an instinct that had probably kept them both alive. Jake hesitated, then asked the question he'd been dreading. What about Katie? Sarah's lips trembled. She tried to escape the second night. Hawk caught her about a mile from the cabin. He said she was too much trouble. Jake closed his eyes briefly. Katie, 17, stubborn, brave like David, had died out here in the frozen dark because she'd refused to surrender. I should have tried harder to save her, Sarah whispered. You saved Tommy, Jake said. You kept him alive for 10 years. David would be proud. The sharp bark of dogs carried through the forest. Closer now. Jake rose instantly. We need to keep moving. Tommy stood, pulling Sarah up with him. Which way? Jake checked his compass and glanced at the terrain. We're about 5 miles from the nearest road, but Torres's men will have roadblocks on it by now. We need high ground, somewhere we can see them coming. The climb was slow through the thick evergreens. The air smelled of pine sap and distant smoke, the cold biting through their clothes. Tommy stayed close to his mother, steadying her when the slope grew icy. Jake couldn't help but notice the way the kid moved, strong, sure-footed, like someone who'd been walking wilderness paths his whole life. Tommy, Jake said between breaths, what did they tell you about the outside world? Hawk said our family was dead. Said no one was looking for us. Said if we ever tried to leave, they'd hunt us down and kill us. Did you believe him? Tommy was quiet for a moment. Mom never did. She always said you'd figure it out eventually. Said you wouldn't give up. Jake's throat tightened. It had taken him 10 years to figure it out. 10 years of Sarah and Tommy trapped while he drowned in guilt and self-loathing. I'm sorry it took so long. You're here now, Sarah said simply. That's what matters. They reached a ridge with a view of the mining camp far below. The snow reflected pinpricks of flashlight beams moving in careful search patterns. At least 6 vehicles were parked in the open space, their headlights sweeping the trails. They've got the main trails covered, Jake said. Then he pointed to the north, where a steep ravine sliced through the forest. That creek leads to the Richardson Highway. 8 miles, most of it downhill. 8 miles through snow and brush, Tommy said. Mom's not strong enough. Sarah straightened, her breath still uneven but her eyes defiant. I've been strong enough to survive 10 years. I can handle 8 miles. Jake didn't argue, but he could see the tremor in her hands. She needed more than determination. She needed help, medical care. His phone buzzed. 3 missed calls. From Jensen. 2 texts. First, FBI en route. Don't do anything stupid. Second, Torres's men have roadblocks on all major roads. Stay hidden. Jake typed quickly. Found Sarah and Tommy. Alive. Need extraction. The reply came almost instantly. Where? He sent the coordinates, adding, Torres has search teams with dogs, running out of time. Another message. FBI helicopters 30 minutes out. Can you stay hidden that long? Jake looked at Sarah, pale and exhausted, leaning on Tommy. Then at the moving lights below. We'll try, he muttered to himself. Turning to them, he said, Help's coming. We just need to stay ahead for 30 minutes. I can't run anymore, Sarah said. Then we don't run, Jake told her. We hide. He led them down into the ravine, where the creek cut a deep channel through the forest floor. The banks were steep and tangled with brush, the fallen trees above forming a natural canopy. The cold here was sharper still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the dark, the dogs were closing in. Here, Jake said, pointing toward an overhang created by the massive root ball of a spruce that had toppled decades ago. The earth had frozen around it, forming a hollow space beneath its tangled roots. We can hide under there. They crawled into the natural shelter, the air damp and sharp with the smell of cold soil and rotting pine needles. The ground was hard enough to bite through their knees, but the darkness swallowed them almost completely. Jake pulled loose branches from the forest floor and laid them across the entrance, weaving them between roots until the shelter was no more than a mound of snow and sticks to the casual eye. Above, the searchers moved closer, crunching boots, muttered orders, bursts of static from radios. A dog barked, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. "Mom," Tommy whispered, his breath fogging the air. "Remember when Dad used to take us camping?" Sarah smiled faintly, a ghost of an expression. "You hated it. Said the woods were too quiet." "I was 8, Tommy whispered back. "Everything seemed too quiet after living in town." Jake listened to their voices, quiet and steady, like a lifeline pulled between them. 10 years they'd been like this, just each other, surviving in a prison without walls. David would have been proud of both of them, Jake thought, even as his chest ached with the knowledge of all they'd lost. The voices above grew louder, clearer. Flashlight beams swept through the trees in thin white arcs, slicing between trunks and roots. Edging closer. "Track leads this way," someone called. "They're following the creek." Sarah's shoulders tensed beside him. Jake could feel it. Years of hiding. Years of flinching at every snap of a branch outside their cabin door. And now, the nightmare was repeating. But this time was different. This time they had someone willing to fight for them. A bark echoed again, closer this time. Jake could hear the animal's panting, the jingle of its collar. The search team couldn't be more than 50 yards away, their scent trail pulling the dog straight toward them. Jake's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Jensen. "Helicopters inbound. Signal when safe." He didn't answer. Signaling now would just hand their position to Torres's men. "They're going to find us," Tommy breathed, his voice tight. "No," Jake said, quiet but certain. He looked from Tommy to Sarah, the nephew he'd thought was gone, the sister-in-law he'd mourned for a decade. "They're not." Before either could react, Jake started to move. "Where are you going?" Sarah grabbed his arm. "To buy you time." Her grip tightened. "Jake, no. We stay together. I'm not losing you again." He held her gaze for a moment, then squeezed her hand and looked at Tommy. "Take care of your mother, and when you get home, tell everyone your father died a hero." Before they could stop him, Jake slid out of the shelter, snow crunching softly under his boots. He climbed the far bank of the ravine, his heart hammering against his ribs. At the top, he found a dry branch as thick as his wrist and stepped on it. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "Over here!" a voice shouted. "Movement on the north bank!" Flashlight beams swung toward him, spearing through the dark. Jake let them catch a glimpse, a moving shadow between the trees, then ducked behind a trunk and ran parallel to the creek, his breath steaming in the freezing air. The dog's barking grew frantic, claws scrabbling in the snow, its handlers stumbling after it. Radio chatter crackled as the search team redirected. Jake made no effort to hide his tracks. Every step, every broken branch, a breadcrumb trail away from the ravine. But then the words came, stopping him cold. "Sir, we've got thermal imaging from the helicopter. 3 heat signatures in the ravine, about 200 meters behind us." Thermal imaging. They could see Sarah and Tommy through the overhang, through the camouflage, through everything. Jake froze, his breath misting in the cold. then yanked his phone out. "Jensen," he said as soon as she picked up. "Jake, where are you? The FBI helicopters are 2 minutes out." "Torres's men have thermal imaging. They found Sarah and Tommy. Get out of there. We'll handle the extraction." "There's no time," Jake said. His eyes were locked on the ravine below, where flashlights were converging on the shelter. 6, maybe 8 men, armed, moving with precision. "Detective," he said quietly, "tell the FBI that Vincent Torres murdered my brother and held my family prisoner for 10 years. Make sure everyone knows." "Jake, what are you—" He hung up, killed the phone, and began moving back toward the ravine, low and fast. The search team's focus was down the slope. Nobody was watching their backs. From the ridge, he saw it all. Sarah and Tommy's shelter, ringed by men with rifles. "Come out," one shouted. "We know you're down there." Silence. "You've got 30 seconds, the leader barked. "Then we start shooting." Jake's eyes flicked to the ground. A fist-sized rock. He hurled it into the trees 50 yards left. Branches cracked. "Movement," one of them shouted. "Check it out," the leader ordered. 3 men peeled away toward the noise. Jake dropped into the ravine from the opposite side, snow spraying under his boots. He was 20 feet from the shelter when the leader pulled a grenade from his vest. "Fire in the hole." Jake surged forward. "Sarah, run!" The grenade rolled toward the shelter, the dull metal catching the light. Jake dove, scooped it up, and hurled it back up the slope. The explosion ripped through the forest, a flash of fire and thunder that shook the ground. Dirt and shards of wood rained down. In the chaos, Sarah and Tommy scrambled from the shelter toward him. "This way," Jake shouted, leading them deeper into the ravine as shouts and gunfire erupted behind them. They scrambled up the far bank of the ravine, boots slipping in loose snow as gunfire cracked behind them. The forest lit up with strobing muzzle flashes, each one searing the dark for an instant before vanishing. Bullets whined past, snapping twigs, punching into tree trunks. "Keep running," Jake barked, shoving Tommy and Sarah forward, keeping his own body between them and the gunfire. His lungs burned, but he didn't slow. Above the chaos, a new sound cut through, deep, rhythmic, building fast. Helicopter rotors, not one, several. Jake's chest tightened. "FBI." From above, a voice boomed through a bullhorn. "Drop your weapons! Drop them now!" The shooting faltered, then stopped. Blinding white searchlights ripped through the tree line, bathing the snow in daylight. Dark figures descended from the sky, fast roping through the beams, their black helmets and tactical vests catching the glare. "Down here!" Jake shouted, waving both arms. His voice cracked with urgency. "We're down here!" A searchlight locked onto them, the white glare swallowing the 3 of them whole. Jake raised his hands, urging Sarah and Tommy to do the same. "3 civilians!" he yelled over the rotors. "The Whitford family!" The helicopter angled down into a clearing 50 yards away. The downdraft whipped snow into a spinning storm. A line of FBI agents moved toward them, weapons held low but ready, eyes scanning the trees. "Jake Whitford," the lead agent called over the roar. "That's me. Detective Jensen sends her regards. Let's get you out of here." The words nearly undid him. For the first time since Copperhead Lake, the world didn't feel like it was collapsing in. They moved toward the helicopter. Around them, Torres's men were being disarmed, zip ties biting into their wrists, their earlier confidence replaced by the stunned realization that their empire had just shattered. Sarah stumbled. Her legs had carried her through fire and forest. But now they were done. Jake caught her, steadying her with one arm. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small against the deafening rotors. Jake met her eyes. "It's over." Tommy stayed close on her other side. At 18, he wore 10 years of captivity in the lines on his young face. But in his eyes, there was something new. Hope. "Uncle Jake," he said as they reached the helicopter's open door. "What happens now?" Jake helped Sarah climb inside, then turned to his nephew. Strong despite everything, ready for a life he'd been denied half of. "Now we go home," Jake said, "and we start over." The helicopter lifted, the ground dropping away. Below, the forest, once their prison, unfurled endlessly, its black ridges stitched with rivers of snow. Other helicopters were setting down, agents fanning out to lock down the crime scene that would finally pull Vincent Torres into the light. Farther out, Copperhead Lake lay still and dark, a perfect mirror holding the stars. It had been the grave of David's SUV, the dumping ground for Hawk McBride's toxic cargo, the place where Jake's life had split in two. But now it was just a lake again. Sarah reached for Jake's hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely carrying over the rotor noise. "For staying alive. For finding us. For not giving up." Jake squeezed back. "Thank you for keeping Tommy safe. For holding on. For surviving." Outside, Alaska stretched away in every direction. Mountains, frozen rivers, endless forest. Harsh, dangerous, and free. They were going home. 6 months later, the cabin felt different. The shadows weren't so heavy, and the air carried the smell of turned soil from the small garden Sarah had insisted on planting behind the house. 10 years of eating what she was given had left her determined to grow her own food. Her hair was lighter now, the steel-gray streaks blending into blonde again. She'd gained weight, and the wary edge in her eyes had softened into something like peace. Tommy emerged from the trees with an armload of firewood. 19 now, taller than David had been, with his father's broad shoulders and the same stubborn jawline. In the months since they'd been freed, he'd devoured the world, learning to drive, mastering a smartphone, discovering how much music and movies he'd missed. But more than anything, he'd learned how to live without fear. "Uncle Jake," Tommy called, stacking the wood neatly. "Sarah Jensen called, wants to know if we're ready for the trial next week." The trial. Torres and 3 of his closest men would face charges for kidnapping, murder, conspiracy, and a litany of environmental crimes. The evidence was ironclad. Bank transfers, shipping manifests, phone calls, and the toxic waste still being pulled from Copperhead Lake. Torres had tried to claim ignorance, that Hawk McBride's operations were a rogue side deal. But the paper trail led straight to him. "Are you ready?" Jake asked Sarah as she came up from the garden, a basket of lettuce in her hands. She set it on the porch railing, her eyes on the valley. "I used to dream about this," she said, "about standing in a courtroom and telling everyone what they did to us. But now that it's here—" "You don't have to," Jake said gently. "They can convict him without you." "No." Her voice was firm. "I need to. Tommy needs to. People need to know." Tommy stepped up beside her, sitting on the porch steps, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I want to tell them about Katie," he said quietly. "About how she never stopped trying to escape. About how brave she was." Jake nodded slowly. "Then we'll tell them," he said. "All of it." Katie's body had never been found, despite searches that stretched for months and combed every ridge, ravine, and frozen creek around Hawk's cabin. Her absence had haunted Sarah every day of captivity. But at the trial, her story would be told. The 17-year-old girl who'd fought to the last breath, who died trying to bring her family home. "There's something else," Sarah said softly. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Her fingers lingered on it for a moment before she held it out to Jake. "I made this for you." Jake peeled the paper away slowly, almost reverently. Inside lay a hand-carved eagle, no bigger than his palm, its wings outstretched as if it were caught in mid-flight. Every feather was etched with meticulous care, the grain of the birchwood giving the illusion of movement. The talons were curled, the beak sharp, the eyes alive with a kind of fierce purpose. "When did you learn to carve?" Jake asked, running his thumb along the ridged detail. 10 years of captivity," Sarah said with the faintest smile. "Hawk brought me tools and wood to keep me busy. He said it was better than having me pace the cabin all day. I think he just wanted the place quieter." Jake turned the carving over. On the base, Etched into the smooth wood were the words, "For Jake, who never stopped looking." His throat tightened. "I don't deserve this." "You do," Tommy said, his voice low but certain. "Mom told me the story 100 times, how you sent them that route because you were lied to, how you blamed yourself for something that wasn't your fault." "It took me 10 years to figure out the truth," Jake murmured. "It took you 10 years to find the evidence," Sarah corrected gently. "But you never stopped believing something was wrong. Detective Jensen told me you called her department every few months for years, asking if there were any new leads." Jake had almost forgotten about those calls. Most had been made late at night after too much whiskey, his guilt gnawing at him until he had to hear someone, anyone, say they were still looking. Jensen had always answered, her voice steady, promising to let him know if anything changed. "She also told me about the searches you organized," Sarah went on. "How you spent your own money on private investigators. How you walked creek beds and ravines, even in winter, looking for the SUV. You didn't stop." "I was looking in the wrong places," Jake said. "You were looking," Sarah replied. "That's what mattered." They let the quiet settle in, the kind of silence that feels earned, not empty. Afternoon sunlight slipped across the valley, painting the mountains in gold. Jake had offered them the cabin, forever, if they wanted it. But Sarah had been determined to build her own life. She'd found work at a local plant nursery, her hands in the soil again. She was saving for a small house with enough land for a big garden. Tommy had enrolled in community college for the fall, studying environmental science. He wanted to help restore places like Copperhead Lake, to take ground stolen by greed and return it to the wild. "Uncle Jake," Tommy said after a while, "can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think Dad would be proud of us? Of how we survived?" Jake looked at his nephew, David's son, grown strong and decent in spite of everything. Then at Sarah, who had kept her boy alive in a prison of pine and snow for a decade, and at the small garden behind them, where fragile shoots pushed up through the soil, proof that life could bloom even in the coldest ground. "Tommy," Jake said, "your father was proud of you before you were even born. He talked about the man you'd become, the things you'd do. And Sarah, David loved you for your strength. He'd be amazed at how you held your family together." Sarah's eyes welled. "I miss him every day." "So do I," Jake said. "But he's not gone. He's in you both, in your stubbornness, in your fight, in the way you watch out for each other." Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Detective Jensen. Torres just accepted a plea deal. Life without parole. He showed them. Sarah read it, then closed her eyes and breathed in, slow and deep. "It's really over." "The legal part is," Jake said. "The rest, the healing, the moving forward, that's just beginning." The sun dipped behind the ridgeline, the last light catching in the eagle carving Jake still held. He thought about the phone call that had started everything. David asking about a route to Anchorage. Just two brothers talking. And how that ordinary moment had opened a decade of loss and guilt and searching. Maybe, Jake thought, it had also led here. To proof that some bonds don't break, even after 10 years of silence. To knowing that hope can live through anything, to the chance to rebuild a family from pieces. Tommy rose, stretching, and looked toward the tree line. "Think I'll go for a walk before dinner." "Don't go too far," Sarah said automatically, then caught herself. "Sorry, old habit." Tommy smiled. "It's okay, Mom. I'll stay close." Jake watched him stride toward the woods. His steps were different now, no longer the cautious shuffle of someone who feared the world outside his door, but the steady gait of a young man who believed it was his. Sarah's gaze followed her son, her expression a tangle of pride and worry, joy and the lingering ache of what had been stolen. "He's going to be okay," Jake said quietly. "I know," Sarah replied. "We all are." Jake looked down at the eagle carving, at the words she'd cut into the wood. For Jake, who never stopped looking. He hadn't. Even when it felt hopeless, Even when it hurt too much to try, even when everyone told him to move on, he hadn't stopped. And in the end, that had been enough. Somewhere out in the woods, Tommy's voice rang back, clear, strong, and full of life. Not calling for help, not in fear, just the sound of being alive. Jake sat back in his chair and let it wash over him. It was the sound of coming home.